They say the moment you meet your fated mate, the world stops. Time freezes, breath catches, and everything you thought you knew about love crumbles into dust. For Sarah Blackwood, standing beneath the harvest moon at the Moonrise Festival, that moment arrived like lightning splitting the darkness. The mate bond snapped into place with devastating certainty when her eyes locked with Kai Thornfield's across the crowded gathering. Golden light seemed to shimmer between them, an invisible thread pulling her soul toward his. Her wolf howled with recognition, with joy, with the absolute knowing that comes only once in a lifetime. But Kai's face twisted with disgust. You? His voice carried across the suddenly silent festival grounds, each word a dagger through her heart. I reject you, Sarah Blackwood. You are not worthy to be my mate. The ancient words of rejection tore through her like claws. The golden thread between them didn't just break, it burned, searing her soul as it snapped. Pain beyond anything physical dropped Sarah to her knees, spiritual agony radiating through every nerve as the mate bond died. Around them, the pack watched in stunned silence. No one had ever seen a public rejection at the sacred festival. The humiliation was almost worse than the pain. As Sarah fled into the dark forest, she didn't see the golden eyes watching from the shadows. Someone else had felt that bond ignite, had witnessed her destruction, and had already begun to plan. 3 weeks. 21 days since the world ended at the Moonrise Festival, and Sarah Blackwood still couldn't breathe properly. The severed mate bond had left a gaping wound in her chest where her heart used to be, a hollow ache that pulsed with every beat. Her wolf, once vibrant and strong, had retreated so deep inside her that some days Sarah wondered if she'd ever surface again. Pack archives smelled of dust and old paper, a sanctuary of forgotten histories where Sarah could hide from the pitying stares and whispered conversations that followed her everywhere. She'd moved to the outskirts of Pack territory, to a small cabin that had once housed visiting scholars. Now it housed the Pack's most spectacular failure. Her fingers traced the spine of an ancient text about bloodline documentation, but the words blurred together. Concentration had become impossible since the rejection. Everything reminded her of what she'd lost, what she'd never had, what she'd been deemed unworthy to possess. Through the window, she could see the main compound in the distance. Smoke rose from the great hall where the pack gathered for meals, for celebrations, for the life that continued without her. Kai was there somewhere, probably planning his new mating ceremony. The thought sent fresh waves of agony through her damaged soul. Her mother had visited yesterday, bringing soup and worried eyes. Margaret Blackwood meant well, but her attempts at comfort only highlighted how thoroughly Sarah had fallen from grace. We knew this might happen, her mother had said gently. Your father and I were not high-ranking. We should have prepared you for the possibility that your mate might be from a more prominent family. But they hadn't prepared her for public humiliation. They hadn't prepared her for the way rejection felt like dying while still breathing. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Elder Morrison stood in the doorway, his weathered face kind but troubled. Pack's leader had always been fair to lower-ranking families, but even his patience had limits. Sarah, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. How are you managing? She almost laughed. Managing was a generous term for barely existing. I'm fine, she lied, closing the book she hadn't been reading. The elder's gray eyes searched her face. Your research work has been exemplary as always, but I'm concerned about your well-being. Perhaps it would help if you had a change of scenery. Sarah's stomach dropped. Was he banishing her? Casting her out entirely? The Silverbrook Research Station has requested an archivist, Morrison continued, his tone carefully neutral. It's in the neutral territories focused on Pack genealogies and historical documentation. The work would suit your skills and the distance might help you heal. Neutral territories. Away from everything familiar, everything that reminded her of her failure. Away from Kai and his new mate and the life she'd never have. When would I leave? She asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Within the week, if you're interested. Morrison leaned forward, genuine concern in his expression. Sarah, rejection isn't a reflection of your worth. Sometimes the moon goddess has different plans than we understand. But if that were true, why did it hurt so much? Why did her wolf remain silent and withdrawn, grieving for a bond that had lasted mere seconds? I'll consider it, she said, though her mind was already made up. Staying here would slowly kill what remained of her spirit. After Morrison left, Sarah stood at the window watching the sun set over the compound. Somewhere in those buildings, Kai was moving on with his life, unmarked by their brief connection. The unfairness of it burned in her throat. She began packing that night, folding her few belongings into a single bag. Most of her possessions held memories she wanted to leave behind. The dress she'd worn to the festival went into the fireplace, silk and dreams consumed by flames. As she worked, a strange sensation prickled along her spine. The feeling of being watched, of eyes tracking her movements. She moved to the window but saw only darkness between the trees. Her damaged wolf stirred slightly, responding to something her human senses couldn't identify. Probably just a curious pack member wondering when the rejected girl would finally leave. But as she turned away from the window, she missed the massive shadow that detached itself from the tree-line. Golden eyes tracked her movements with patient intensity, memorizing every detail of her face, her scent, her obvious pain. The watcher had been coming every night since the rejection, drawn by forces he didn't fully understand. There was something about this particular female, something that called to the predator in him with irresistible pull. Her pain sang in his blood, her isolation making her perfect prey. Soon she would be alone in the neutral territories, away from pack protection and family support. Soon she would be vulnerable in ways that made his wolf pace with anticipation. The Alpha King had waited over a century for the right mate. He could wait a little longer to claim what was meant to be his. The Silverbrook research station emerged from the mountain mist like something from a fairy tale, all stone towers and ivy-covered walls nestled against a backdrop of ancient pines. Sarah pressed her face to the transport van's window, drinking in her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The neutral territories felt different from packlands, wilder somehow, as if the very air hummed with untamed energy. Dr. Elena Cross waited on the station's front steps, a woman in her 50s with prematurely silver hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. Her smile was warm but guarded as she helped Sarah with her single bag. "Welcome to Silverbrook," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent Sarah couldn't place. "I hope you'll find the work here fulfilling. We study things most packs prefer to forget." The station's interior was a maze of narrow corridors lined with bookshelves that stretched to impossibly high ceilings. Ancient texts bound in leather and scales filled every available space, their titles written in languages Sarah didn't recognize. The air smelled of old parchment and something else, something wild and musky that made her damaged wolf stir restlessly. Elena led her through the labyrinth, pointing out various departments. "We have researchers from all supernatural communities here," she explained. "Vampires who study blood magic history, witches documenting spell evolution, even a few Fae scholars working on treaty analyses. You'll be in the bloodline documentation department, tracing pack genealogies and inheritance patterns." Sarah's cabin sat at the station's edge, a cozy stone cottage overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, everything was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, bookshelves lined another, and large windows offered views of the surrounding wilderness. "You'll find the work absorbing," Elena said, setting a welcome basket on the kitchen counter. "But don't isolate yourself completely. The other researchers are good people and we have communal dinners twice a week." That night, alone for the first time since leaving pack territory, Sarah tried to settle into her new routine. She unpacked her few belongings, arranged her research materials, and attempted to read through the files Elena had provided. But concentration remained elusive. Every sound from the forest beyond her windows made her jump, made her damaged wolf lift its head with something almost like interest. The first gift appeared 3 days later. Sarah emerged from her cabin to find a freshly killed rabbit on her doorstep, its neck cleanly broken and its fur unmarked by scavenger teeth. She looked around the clearing but saw nothing except morning mist rising from the valley below. Probably a local predator marking territory, she told herself, disposing of the carcass in the woods. But the gesture felt too deliberate, too much like an offering. Her work proved as absorbing as Elena had promised. The bloodline records were fascinating, revealing patterns of inheritance and genetic quirks that painted a complex picture of supernatural evolution. Some families carried latent magical abilities that skipped generations. Others showed signs of hybrid ancestry, mixing wolf blood with vampire or fae lineages in ways that created entirely new supernatural categories. But it was the Luna bloodline documentation that truly captured her attention. References to an ancient matriarchal line appeared throughout pack histories, always associated with unusual power and tragic endings. Luna females could supposedly bond with multiple alphas, creating pack alliances that lasted for generations. But they also died young, their bodies unable to contain the supernatural energy of multiple mate bonds. The gifts continued. Every few days, Sarah would find something new on her doorstep. A bundle of rare herbs tied with grass. Polished stones arranged in careful patterns. Once, impossibly, a cluster of winter roses that shouldn't have bloomed for months. Each offering felt more personal than the last, as if someone was learning her preferences and adjusting accordingly. Other researchers mentioned seeing things in the woods. Dr. James Hartwell, a vampire who studied feeding pattern evolution, swore he'd glimpsed something massive moving between the trees during his evening walks. Sarah Chen, a witch documenting spell component harvesting, found oversized paw prints near her cabin that didn't match any known local wildlife. "There's definitely something large out there," she told Sarah over communal dinner. "I've lived in wild places my entire life and I've never seen tracks that size. Whatever made them has to weigh at least 200 pounds. Elena always deflected such conversations with scientific explanations. "Probably a black bear," she would say, "or perhaps someone's lost livestock." The neutral territories attract all sorts of unusual visitors. But Sarah noticed how Elena's eyes darted to the windows when they discussed the mysterious creature, how she insisted everyone be inside by sunset, how she'd installed new security measures that seemed excessive for a research facility. Truth came to Sarah during her 4th week at Silverbrook. She'd been working late in the archives, absorbed in a particularly fascinating bloodline chart, when she realized the building had gone completely silent. Even the usual night sounds from the forest had ceased, as if every living thing was holding its breath. She gathered her materials and headed for the exit, but froze when she reached the main corridor. Through the tall windows that faced the valley, she could see something moving in the moonlight. Something enormous and dark that flowed like liquid shadow between the trees. Sarah pressed herself against the glass, straining to make out details. The creature was definitely lupin, but larger than any wolf she'd ever seen. Its fur was so dark it seemed to absorb moonlight, and when it turned its head, she caught a glimpse of eyes that glowed like molten gold. Those eyes found hers through the window, and Sarah's breath stopped entirely. The wolf was looking directly at her, its massive head tilted as if studying her reaction. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the distance, predator and prey locked in silent communication. Then the creature turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Sarah wondering if she'd imagined the entire encounter. But she knew she hadn't. Something was out there, something that had been watching her, learning about her, leaving gifts like a suitor courting a mate. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, her damaged wolf stirred with something that felt dangerously like interest. For the first time since the rejection, Sarah felt truly alive. The storm struck Silverbrook with the fury of something personal, as if the sky itself had chosen violence. Wind howled through the valley like a living thing, bending ancient pines until their tops nearly touched the ground. Rain lashed against Sarah's cabin windows with such force she feared the glass might shatter. Power had failed an hour ago, leaving her surrounded by flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls. She tried to continue reading, but the storm's intensity made concentration impossible. Every crack of thunder seemed to shake the very foundations of her small sanctuary. Lightning illuminated the clearing in stark white flashes, revealing a world transformed by wind and water. Between the strobing light and driving rain, Sarah thought she glimpsed movement near the tree line. Something large and dark that didn't flee from the storm's violence. The next flash of lightning revealed empty forest. She was reaching for another candle when her front door exploded inward. The man who filled her doorway was soaked to the skin, dark hair plastered against his skull, but he radiated power that made the storm outside seem tame by comparison. Water streamed from his black coat, pooling on her wooden floor, yet he stood utterly still as if the chaos behind him was merely an inconvenience. Sarah's wolf, dormant for weeks, suddenly surged to attention with a mixture of recognition and primal terror. This was an alpha. Not just any alpha, but something far more dangerous. Every instinct screamed at her to submit, to bare her throat, to acknowledge the absolute authority that rolled off him in waves. But her human mind fought back, keeping her frozen in place beside the fireplace. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. "The storm caught me off guard, and your light was visible through the trees." He stepped inside without invitation, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. In the candlelight, his features were sharp and aristocratic, all clean lines and predatory grace. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. Golden, like the wolf she'd seen through the window, with an intensity that suggested he saw far more than he revealed. "I'm Adrian," he said simply, as if the name should mean something to her. Sarah found her voice with effort. "Sarah Blackwood. You're welcome to wait out the storm, though I should mention the power is out." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, transforming his stern features into something devastatingly beautiful. "I noticed. Candlelight suits you." Compliment sent heat racing through her veins, followed immediately by confusion. When was the last time anyone had looked at her with appreciation rather than pity? When had anyone made her feel desirable instead of discarded? "You work at the research station," Adrian continued, moving closer with fluid grace. "Your research on bloodline documentation is quite thorough." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You've read my work?" "I make it my business to know about interesting people in the neutral territories." His golden eyes held hers captive, especially those with such tragic recent histories. The words hit like a physical blow. He knew about the rejection. Somehow, this stranger knew about her humiliation at the Moonrise Festival, about Kai's cruel dismissal, about her exile to these remote mountains. "I don't know what you've heard," she began, but Adrian raised a hand to silence her. "I heard that a fool rejected his fated mate in front of his entire pack," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I heard that Kai Thornfield chose pride over destiny and left his true mate bleeding on sacred ground." Sarah's breath caught. No one spoke about the rejection so bluntly, with such obvious contempt for Kai's decision. In pack territory, everyone had treated the incident with careful diplomacy, as if acknowledging the cruelty might somehow make it worse. "It wasn't meant to be," she whispered, the practiced words falling from her lips like a prayer she no longer believed. Adrian moved closer, close enough that she could smell rain and pine and something wildly masculine that made her wolf pace restlessly. "Wasn't it?" he asked softly. "Or was it simply that Kai Thornfield lacks the strength to claim what the moon goddess offered him?" The candles flickered in a sudden draft, throwing Adrian's face into stark relief. For a moment, his features seemed almost feral, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something ancient and predatory lurking beneath his civilized facade. Lightning crashed outside, illuminating the cabin in brilliant white light. In that instant, Sarah could have sworn Adrian's eyes flashed gold, the same molten color she'd seen in the massive wolf that had been stalking the research station. Impossible. Creature she'd glimpsed had been enormous, far too large to be a normal shifter. And this man, despite his obvious alpha status, was still human in form. "Are you all right?" Adrian asked, and she realized she'd been staring. Fine, she managed. Just tired. The storm is making me jumpy. Understandable. He moved to her small kitchen, helping himself to the kettle with casual familiarity. Storms can bring out the predators. Lucky for you, I happen to be in the area. The way he said predators sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. There was something in his tone, a dark amusement that suggested he knew exactly what kind of predators prowled these mountains. What brings you to the neutral territories? She asked, settling into one of her chairs while he prepared tea with movements that suggested long practice. Business, he replied vaguely. I have interests in various supernatural communities. Research facilities like Silverbrook fall under my purview. His purview. The words were carefully chosen, revealing nothing while implying everything. This wasn't a man who simply had business interests. This was someone who controlled them. Adrian brought her tea in one of her own mugs, but when their fingers brushed during the exchange, electricity shot up her arm. Contact lasted only seconds, but it left her skin tingling and her wolf whimpering with something that felt dangerously like need. You're recovering well, he observed, settling into the chair across from her. From the rejection, I mean. Your wolf is stronger than when you first arrived here. How could he possibly know that? Sarah studied his face, searching for answers in those impossible golden eyes. You seem to know a great deal about me for a stranger. The smile returned, and this time it held a predatory edge that made her pulse quicken. I make it my business to know about exceptional women. And you, Sarah Blackwood, are far more exceptional than you realize. Thunder rolled overhead, but the sound seemed distant now, as if the storm was moving away. Or perhaps Adrian's presence simply made everything else fade into background noise. The way he looked at her with such focused intensity made her feel like the most important thing in his world. It was intoxicating. Dangerous. Absolutely nothing like the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to from her former packmates. Power chose that moment to flicker back to life, electric lights banishing the intimate candlelit atmosphere. Adrian glanced at the overhead fixture with what looked like disappointment. I should go, he said, rising with fluid grace. The storm has passed and you need your rest. But he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he approached her chair, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. This close, she could see flecks of amber in his golden eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Thank you for the shelter, he said softly, reaching out to touch her cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle. Sleep well, Sarah. Dream of better things than rejection and pain. Touch sent fire racing through her nerves, awakening parts of her that had been dormant since the mate bond severed. For a wild moment, she wanted to lean into that caress, to beg him to stay, to lose herself in the promise she saw in his dangerous eyes. Instead, she sat frozen as he moved to the door, pausing on the threshold to look back at her one final time. I have a feeling we'll see each other again soon, he said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he'd appeared. Sarah remained in her chair for a long time after his departure, touching her cheek where his fingers had lingered. Sighed, the storm had indeed passed, leaving only the gentle sound of rain dripping from the eaves. But inside her cabin, the air still hummed with the memory of his presence, and her wolf paced restlessly, hungry for something she couldn't name. Adrian returned 3 days later, arriving at the research station in a black sedan that gleamed like liquid obsidian in the morning sun. Sarah watched from her office window as he emerged from the vehicle, moving with that same predatory grace she remembered from the storm. Today he wore an expensive charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build, looking every inch the powerful businessman he claimed to be. But Sarah's wolf knew better. Beneath the civilized exterior lurked something far more dangerous. He found her in the archives, bent over a particularly complex bloodline chart that traced pack alliances through the centuries. The scent of pine and rain announced his presence before he spoke, making her pulse quicken despite her attempts at composure. Miss Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying that same low rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I have some materials that might interest you." He set a leather portfolio on her desk, his fingers brushing hers as she reached for it. Contact sent familiar electricity shooting up her arm, and she noticed how his touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Inside the portfolio were documents she'd never seen before, bloodline records from packs that had supposedly lost their histories in various disasters. The information was incredibly valuable, the kind of research gold that historians spent careers searching for. "Where did you find these?" she asked, unable to hide her excitement as she examined the ancient parchments. "I have connections in various supernatural communities," Adrian replied, moving to stand behind her chair. "When I mentioned your work to a colleague, he remembered having these in his private collection." His presence behind her was overwhelming, his body heat warming her back while his scent surrounded her like an invisible embrace. When he leaned over her shoulder to point out a particular entry, his breath stirred the hair at her neck. "This bloodline here," he said, his finger tracing a genealogical line on the parchment. "See how it connects to the original Luna families? Your research on that particular lineage has been remarkably thorough." Sarah tried to focus on the documents, but Adrian's proximity made thinking difficult. The way he said Luna families carried an undertone she couldn't identify, as if the words held personal significance. "These must be worth a fortune," she managed. "I can't possibly accept something so valuable." "Consider it an investment in important research," Adrian said, straightening but not stepping away. "Knowledge belongs to those who can best use it." Over the following weeks, Adrian's visits became a regular occurrence. He arrived bearing rare texts, unusual artifacts, and always some excuse to discuss Sarah's work in detail. Each visit brought increasingly expensive gifts wrapped in the guise of research assistance. A first-edition manuscript on pack law that belonged in a museum. Ancient amber jewelry that supposedly contained trace minerals useful for supernatural genealogy studies. A bottle of wine so rare that Sarah was afraid to open it, claiming it would help her understand the cultural context of blood bonding rituals. Other researchers began to notice the special attention. Dr. Hartwell raised an eyebrow when Adrian brought Sarah lunch from an exclusive restaurant 2 hours away. Sarah Chen made pointed comments about favoritism when Adrian personally delivered a new computer system to Sarah's office. Even the maintenance staff whispered about the mysterious benefactor who seemed so interested in the bloodline department. But it was Dr. Cross who finally voiced the concerns everyone was thinking. She found Sarah working late one evening, surrounded by the gifts Adrian had provided. Elena's expression was troubled as she settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "About Adrian Nightfall." The surname hit Sarah like a physical blow. Nightfall. She'd heard that name before, whispered in the same tones reserved for legends and nightmares. "Adrian Nightfall," Elena continued, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "The Alpha King. Ruler of all North American packs for the past century. One of the most powerful supernatural beings alive." Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the manuscript she'd been reading. The Alpha King. No wonder her wolf responded to him with such intense submission. No wonder his very presence seemed to command the air around him. "He's been courting you," Elena said gently. "And I'm concerned about what that means for your safety." "Courting me?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "But he said he was here on business, that research facilities fall under his purview." "They do. He owns most of the neutral territories, including this station. But his interest in you is clearly personal." Elena leaned forward, her expression grave. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about Adrian Nightfall's history with women." That night, alone in her cabin, Sarah researched everything she could find about the Alpha King. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Adrian Nightfall had ruled the supernatural world for over a century, accumulating power and territory with ruthless efficiency. But it was his romantic history that painted the darkest picture. Over the decades, he'd taken numerous companions, always beautiful, always from lower-ranking families, always women who seemed to simply disappear from public record after a few years. The official explanations varied. Some had supposedly died in accidents. Others had chosen exile from supernatural society. A few had simply vanished without explanation, their fates unknown and uninvestigated. Pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Adrian collected women like rare artifacts, treasuring them intensely before growing bored and moving on. The difference was that his discarded lovers didn't survive the experience. Yet even knowing this, Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits with anticipation that bordered on addiction. When he touched her hand while pointing out details in ancient texts, her skin burned for hours afterward. When he smiled at her insights, she felt more valued than she had in months. When he looked at her with those impossible golden eyes, she felt beautiful and desired instead of rejected and worthless. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about predators and patterns, about powerful men who consumed what they desired. But her heart, still wounded from Kai's rejection, craved the attention Adrian showered on her. He made her feel special, chosen, worthy of devotion from someone who could have anyone. After a lifetime of being overlooked and a rejection that had shattered her self-worth, Adrian's interest felt like salvation, even if it might ultimately prove to be her destruction. The next morning brought Adrian's most extravagant gift yet, a collection of Luna bloodline artifacts that belonged in the supernatural equivalent of the Smithsonian. As Sarah examined the priceless relics, she couldn't help but wonder if she was looking at her own future treasures. Beautiful objects collected by a powerful man, admired briefly, then stored away when something newer caught his attention. But when Adrian arrived that afternoon and smiled at her with genuine warmth, when he asked about her research with obvious respect for her intelligence, when he touched her cheek with gentle fingers and called her remarkable, all her logical fears evaporated like morning mist. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps she was special enough to hold the Alpha King's interest. Perhaps her damaged heart had finally found someone who would never reject her. The hope was as dangerous as it was intoxicating, and Sarah found herself drowning in it willingly. The dreams began the night after Adrian's third visit, vivid and consuming in ways that left Sarah gasping awake with her heart racing and her skin flushed with desire. In sleep, she found herself deep in moonlit forests where a massive black wolf stalked through silver shadows, its golden eyes burning with primal hunger. Creature was enormous, far larger than any natural wolf, with midnight fur that seemed to absorb starlight and muscles that rippled beneath its coat like liquid power. When it looked at her in the dreams, Sarah felt recognition click into place with devastating certainty. This was no ordinary predator. This was something ancient and magnificent and utterly focused on claiming her. In the dream realm, she didn't flee. Instead, she moved toward the beast with surrender that felt more natural than breathing. When powerful jaws closed gently around her throat, when sharp teeth pressed against her pulse point without breaking skin, when the wolf's weight settled over her in perfect dominance, Sarah felt more complete than she ever had in waking life. The dreams always ended the same way, with phantom sensations of fur beneath her fingers and the taste of pine and earth on her lips. She would wake aching with need that no amount of cold water could wash away, her damaged wolf stirring with interest it hadn't shown since the rejection. During daylight hours, Adrian's seduction intensified with calculated precision. He arrived bearing increasingly elaborate gestures designed to demonstrate his power and resources. Private helicopter rides over territories that stretched beyond the horizon, all of which he casually mentioned owning. Dinners at exclusive restaurants where staff treated him with the deference reserved for royalty. Tours of ancient pack sites where he shared stories that could only come from someone who had witnessed the events firsthand. "You're older than you look," Sarah observed during one such excursion, studying his face for signs of the century he claimed to have lived. Adrian's smile held secrets that made her pulse quicken. "Supernatural genetics have their advantages," he replied, reaching across the helicopter's cabin to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Touch lingered, his thumb tracing her jawline with possessive gentleness. Some of us age very slowly when we find reasons to stay vital. The implications in his words made her breath catch. Was he suggesting she was his reason for remaining young? The thought should have seemed ridiculous, but the intensity in his golden eyes made it feel like gospel truth. Each interaction grew more intimate, more charged with tension that made the air between them practically hum with electricity. Adrian found excuses to touch her constantly. A hand at the small of her back as he guided her through doorways. Fingers brushing hers when he passed documents. Casual contact that sent fire racing through her nervous system and left her craving more. But it was the way other supernatural beings reacted to his scent on her that truly drove home the danger of her situation. When pack representatives visited the research station, their responses to Sarah's presence became increasingly troubling. Wolves who had previously treated her with casual courtesy now approached with obvious nervousness, their nostrils flaring as they caught Adrian's lingering essence on her skin and clothes. Dr. Reyes, a pack historian from the Eastern Territories, actually backed away when Sarah entered the conference room. His face went pale as he scented the air around her, and she caught him whispering urgently to his assistant about territorial markings and predator warnings. During a break in their meeting, she overheard two visiting researchers discussing her situation in hushed voices outside the ladies' room. "Can you smell it on her?" one asked, her voice tight with concern. "The Alpha King's scent is all over that girl. Poor thing probably has no idea what she's gotten herself into," the other replied. "Did you see how she lit up when someone mentioned his name? She's completely under his spell. You know what happened to the last one, don't you?" The first voice dropped to barely a whisper. Disappeared without a trace. One day she was living in his compound, wearing his gifts, playing the perfect companion. The next day it was like she never existed. "They always think they're special," the second voice said sadly. "They always believe they'll be the one to hold his interest permanently. But the king's obsessions burn bright and brief. When he grows bored, well, let's just say his former lovers don't tend to relocate to somewhere tropical." Sarah pressed herself against the bathroom wall, her blood turning to ice as the implications sank in. She wasn't the first woman to catch Adrian's attention. There had been others, women who had received his gifts and basked in his focused interest, women who had believed themselves chosen and special. Women who had vanished when his fascination faded. That night, she tried to research Adrian's previous companions more thoroughly, but found herself frustrated by the lack of concrete information. Official records were sparse and sanitized, mentioning women only in passing before they seemed to simply evaporate from documented existence. But she did find photographs in old Supernatural Society magazines, images of Adrian at various functions over the decades with different beautiful women at his side. A redhead with emerald eyes who appeared in pictures from the 1970s before vanishing from all subsequent coverage. A blonde with aristocratic features who showed up in 1990s social pages for exactly 2 years. A brunette with exotic beauty who graced party photos throughout the early 2000s before disappearing entirely. All of them gorgeous. All of them gazing at Adrian with obvious adoration. All of them seemingly erased from existence after their brief moment in his spotlight. Yet despite the mounting evidence of danger, Sarah found herself anticipating Adrian's visits with addiction that bordered on pathological. When he looked at her with those burning golden eyes, when he spoke to her with genuine respect for her intelligence, when he touched her with reverent gentleness, all rational thought fled. He made her feel precious, desired, worthy of devotion from someone who commanded the supernatural world. After months of rejection and isolation, Adrian's attention felt like coming back to life. The fact that it might ultimately lead to her destruction seemed almost irrelevant compared to the joy of feeling wanted again. Her dreams grew more intense, more explicitly sexual, blurring the lines between sleeping and waking desire. The Black Wolf claimed her in increasingly vivid scenarios, marking her as his own with possessive thoroughness that left her breathless. Sometimes she woke to find herself calling out his name, her body arched in desperate need for touch that never came. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about patterns and predators, about powerful men who consumed what they desired without thought for the consequences. But her wounded heart craved the validation Adrian provided, the sense of being special and chosen that helped heal the trauma of Kai's rejection. Even knowing she was likely walking toward her own destruction, Sarah found herself unable to resist the pull of Adrian's dangerous magnetism. Like a moth drawn to flame, she moved inexorably toward the heat that would either transform her or destroy her. The only question was which outcome would claim her first. Sarah was cataloging a collection of Luna bloodline artifacts when the delegation arrived, 3 black SUVs winding up the mountain road in perfect formation. Through her office window, she watched as pack members emerged from the vehicles, their movements coordinated with military precision. Her breath caught when she recognized the figure leading them. Kai Thornfield stepped from the lead vehicle like something from her worst nightmares, his familiar form triggering a cascade of memories she'd worked so hard to bury. He looked older somehow, his boyish features sharpened by responsibility and stress. The Beta heir carried himself with new authority, but his eyes held shadows that hadn't been there at the Moonrise Festival. Behind him came his father, Beta Marcus Thornfield, along with several pack enforcers whose presence suggested this wasn't a social visit. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the ancient chalice she'd been examining, her damaged wolf stirring with confused emotions she didn't want to examine. Dr. Cross appeared in her doorway within minutes, her expression carefully neutral. "We have visitors from your former pack," she said gently. "They've requested a meeting with you specifically." Sarah followed Elena to the main conference room, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. She hadn't seen Kai since that terrible night at the festival, hadn't spoken to anyone from her birth pack since accepting the transfer to Silverbrook. The sight of him sitting at the polished table, hands clasped before him like a supplicant, sent conflicting waves of pain and anger through her system. "Sarah," he said, rising when she entered. His voice carried the same warm timbre she remembered, but now it held notes of desperation that made her wolf whine in confusion. "You look well." She took the seat across from him, keeping the table between them like a barrier. "What brings you to the neutral territories, Kai?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Kai's father shifted uncomfortably beside his son, his weathered face creased with worry. "We've come to warn you," Beta Marcus said without preamble, "about the Alpha King's interest in you." The words hit like a physical blow. How did they know about Adrian? Sarah kept her expression carefully blank, unwilling to confirm or deny anything. "His scent is all over this place," Kai said, his nostrils flaring with obvious agitation. "All over you." He leaned forward, intensity radiating from his every line. "Sarah, you have to understand, Adrian Nightfall is dangerous in ways you can't imagine." Protectiveness in his voice sent rage blazing through her chest. How dare he? How dare he come here after publicly rejecting her, after humiliating her in front of their entire pack, and presume to offer warnings about her choices? "You rejected me," she said, her voice low and deadly calm. "You declared me unworthy in front of everyone who mattered to me. You don't get to have opinions about my life anymore." Pain flashed across Kai's features, but he pressed forward with stubborn determination. "I rejected you to protect you," he said desperately. "Pack's Elder Council received prophecies about your bloodline, about the danger it would attract. I thought if I severed our bond publicly, if I made it clear you belonged to no one, it might keep you safe." Sarah stared at him in shock. Prophecies? About her bloodline? The Luna artifacts she'd been studying suddenly took on new significance, their presence at Silverbrook no longer seeming quite so coincidental. "What kind of prophecies?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Beta Marcus leaned forward, his expression grave. Ancient bloodlines calling to ancient powers. The return of the Luna Queens and the kings who would claim them. War among the supernatural factions for control of that power. Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened with deliberate slowness. Adrian stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding every eye in the room. He was dressed in an immaculate black suit that emphasized his predatory grace, and his golden eyes held a cold satisfaction that made Sarah's breath catch. "Gentlemen," he said pleasantly, though his voice carried undertones of barely leashed violence, "I wasn't aware we were expecting visitors from the Thornfield pack." Kai rose slowly, every muscle in his body tensed for conflict. His father placed a restraining hand on his arm, but the younger wolf shook him off with barely contained aggression. "Alpha King," Kai said, the title dripping with barely concealed hostility. "We've come to collect what belongs to our pack." Adrian's smile was all sharp edges and predatory amusement. "How interesting. And what, exactly, do you believe belongs to your pack in my territory?" Sarah watched the two alphas circle each other like wolves preparing for battle, the air between them crackling with supernatural tension. Despite Kai's obvious strength, he seemed almost diminished next to Adrian's commanding presence. It was like watching a house cat face off against a panther. "Sarah was born into our pack," Kai said, his voice rising with desperation. "She's under our protection, our responsibility. We won't allow you to harm her." "Harm her?" Adrian's laugh held genuine amusement. "Young pup, you seem to be laboring under several misapprehensions. First, Sarah chose to leave your pack after you publicly rejected and humiliated her. Second, she's in my territory under my protection now. And third," Adrian's eyes began to glow with inner fire, "you have no idea what she truly is." Temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Adrian's power filled the space. Sarah felt her wolf instinctively submit to his authority, even as her human mind recoiled from the display of dominance. "What I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the supernatural tension. Adrian turned to her, his expression softening with something that might have been affection. "You're descended from the original Luna bloodline, my dear. The first wolves who could bond with multiple alphas, creating pack alliances that shaped the supernatural world for centuries." The words hit the room like a bomb. Beta Marcus went pale, while Kai stumbled backward as if physically struck. "That's impossible," Kai breathed. "The Luna bloodlines died out generations ago." Adrian's smile turned predatory. "Did they? Or did they simply learn to hide, to blend into lesser bloodlines until the time was right for their return?" He moved closer to Sarah, his presence wrapping around her like a physical embrace. "The power you've been sensing, the way your wolf responds to supernatural energy, the reason every alpha who encounters you feels the pull of recognition. You're not just any rejected mate, Sarah. You're the key to reshaping the entire supernatural hierarchy." Sarah felt the world tilting around her as the implications sank in. Her research into Luna bloodlines hadn't been academic curiosity. It had been her own heritage calling to her, her blood recognizing the truth her mind couldn't accept. "And that," Adrian continued, his golden eyes boring into Kai's with obvious satisfaction, "is why she belongs with me. A Luna queen needs an alpha king, not some beta's son who lacks the vision to recognize what fate placed in his hands." The insult hit its mark. With a snarl of pure rage, Kai lunged across the table toward Adrian, his wolf surging to the surface in a blur of supernatural speed. Adrian caught him mid-leap with casual ease, one hand wrapped around Kai's throat as he held the younger wolf suspended in the air. The display of power was terrifying in its effortlessness. "Child," Adrian said conversationally while Kai struggled in his grip, "you should learn to control your temper. Makes you sloppy." He released Kai, who collapsed to his knees gasping for breath. Beta Marcus and the pack enforcers moved to help him, but their faces showed they understood exactly how outmatched they were. "Take your delegation and leave my territory," Adrian commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And don't return. Sarah has made her choice." But as the Thornfield pack retreated in defeat, Sarah couldn't help but notice the satisfaction in Adrian's golden eyes. He had gotten exactly what he wanted from this confrontation. Question was whether she was strong enough to survive being the prize in a game whose rules she was only beginning to understand. Dr. Elena Cross found Sarah in the archives 3 hours after the confrontation, sitting motionless among scattered Luna bloodline documents. The older woman's face carried an expression Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of guilt and resignation that immediately set off warning bells. "We need to talk," Elena said, closing the archive door behind her with deliberate care. "About why you're really here." Sarah looked up from the genealogy charts she'd been staring at without seeing. The adrenaline from watching two alphas nearly tear each other apart had faded, leaving her feeling hollow and confused. "What do you mean?" Elena moved to the window, her back turned as she spoke. "Your assignment to Silverbrook wasn't random, Sarah. None of this has been random. Your transfer request, your placement in bloodline documentation, even your specific research into Luna lineages. It was all carefully orchestrated." The words hit like ice water in Sarah's veins. "Orchestrated by whom?" Elena turned, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "By Adrian Nightfall. I work for him, Sarah. I have for the past 30 years. My job here isn't just running a research facility. It's monitoring supernatural bloodlines, tracking genetic anomalies, and most importantly, identifying descendants of extinct power lines." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. "You've been watching me, studying me, reporting to him about my work, my progress, my personal life. Your bloodline research triggered several genetic markers we've been monitoring for decades," Elena continued, her voice thick with regret. "Markers that suggested possible Luna heritage. When you requested transfer after the rejection, Adrian saw an opportunity to bring you somewhere he could observe you more closely." The rejection. Sarah's mind raced, connecting dots she'd been too naive to see before. Did he orchestrate that too? Did he somehow influence Kai to reject me publicly? Elena shook her head. That was genuine, though Adrian certainly took advantage of the opportunity it provided. Kai's rejection made you vulnerable, isolated, perfect for Adrian's purposes. And what purposes are those? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Elena moved to the ancient texts scattered across Sarah's desk, her fingers tracing the Luna bloodline genealogies with reverent care. "Do you understand what these documents really represent? Not just historical curiosities, but a roadmap to power that could reshape the entire supernatural world." She opened one of the oldest manuscripts, revealing illuminated pages that depicted wolves of extraordinary size and beauty. The original Luna bloodline females could bond with multiple alphas simultaneously, creating pack alliances that lasted for generations. Their children inherited enhanced abilities from both parents, becoming stronger, faster, more magically gifted than ordinary wolves. "But there was a price," Elena continued, turning to a page that showed a woman in obvious agony. Luna bloodline females often died in childbirth. Their bodies couldn't contain the supernatural energy of multiple mate bonds, especially when carrying children who inherited those same volatile powers. Sarah stared at the horrific illustrations, images of women whose bodies were literally torn apart by the forces they carried. "How many died?" "Most of them," Elena said quietly. "Which is why the bloodline was believed extinct. The few Luna females who survived learned to hide their heritage, to dilute their blood through generations of careful breeding until the power lay dormant." "Until me," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her like poison. "Till you," Elena confirmed. "Your research into your own genealogy, your instinctive understanding of bloodline patterns, your wolf's unusual responses to supernatural energy. All signs that the Luna power was awakening in you." Sarah thought about her dreams, the way her wolf had responded to Adrian's presence, the strange pull she felt towards supernatural mysteries she'd always attributed to academic curiosity. It had been her blood calling to her, her heritage asserting itself despite generations of careful suppression. "Adrian has been searching for a surviving Luna descendant for decades," Elena continued. "He believes such a mate could enhance his own power exponentially, allow him to control not just North American wolf packs but all supernatural creatures." "Control them how?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Through the bond," Elena explained. A luna's connection to multiple alphas creates a network of supernatural influence. If Adrian could claim a luna mate, he could theoretically extend his authority through that network to every supernatural being she's ever touched, ever influenced, ever bonded with even temporarily. The implications were staggering. Adrian wasn't just seeking a powerful mate. He was seeking a weapon, a living conduit through which he could dominate the entire supernatural world. But the pregnancy risk, Sarah said desperately. Surely he wouldn't want to lose his mate to childbirth. Elena's expression grew even more troubled. There are ancient rituals, dark magic practices that might allow a Luna to survive pregnancy. But they require tremendous sacrifice, usually from other supernatural beings. Adrian has been collecting supernatural artifacts for decades, preparing for the possibility of finding his Luna mate. Sarah felt sick as she remembered all the gifts Adrian had brought her. The priceless artifacts he'd claimed were for research purposes. He hadn't been courting her with romantic gestures. He'd been gathering the magical components needed to keep her alive long enough to serve his purposes. "Everything has been a lie," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The research position, your mentorship, even my escape from Pack territory after the rejection. All of it designed to deliver me into his hands." "Not everything," Elena said urgently. "My care for you, my concern for your well-being, that's real. Which is why I'm telling you this now, while there's still time to run." "Run where?" Sarah asked bitterly. "He's the Alpha King. He controls most of the supernatural world. Where could I possibly go that he wouldn't find me?" "There are places," Elena insisted. "Neutral territories he doesn't control, supernatural communities that resist his authority. The Fae courts, the vampire covens, even some of the witch circles would offer protection to keep a Luna out of his hands." Sarah stared at the manuscripts spread before her, at the faces of women who had loved and suffered and died for powers they never asked for. Was that her fate? To spend her life running from a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool for his ambitions? Or to submit to those ambitions and become complicit in reshaping the supernatural world according to his will? Elena gripped her shoulders, forcing Sarah to meet her eyes. "You have more power than you realize," she said urgently. Luna bloodline females weren't just victims of their heritage. They were leaders, queens who shaped supernatural society for centuries. You don't have to be Adrian's weapon. You could choose to be your own. But even as Elena spoke those encouraging words, Sarah could feel Adrian's presence approaching. His scent reached her through the archive's thick walls, that intoxicating combination of pine and rain and ancient power that made her wolf whimper with recognition. He was coming for her, and despite everything she'd just learned, despite the manipulation and lies and calculated seduction, part of her still yearned to surrender to his dangerous embrace. The door opened without a knock, and Adrian filled the doorway like a force of nature. His golden eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered manuscripts and Elena's guilty expression with predatory intelligence. "Ladies," he said pleasantly, though his voice carried undertones that made both women tense. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Elena stepped protectively in front of Sarah, but they both knew it was a futile gesture. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the Alpha King who had orchestrated every moment of this encounter. Adrian's smile held the satisfaction of a hunter whose trap had finally sprung. "Now, my dear Sarah, I believe it's time we had a more honest conversation about your future." The attack came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the valley floor and most of the research station slept in peaceful ignorance. Sarah jerked awake to the sound of shattering glass and inhuman screams that seemed to pour from every direction at once. Through her cabin window, she could see dark shapes moving with supernatural speed between the buildings. Some were clearly vampires, their pale forms blurring as they scaled walls with spider-like agility. Others moved with the fluid grace of shifted wolves, but their scents were wrong, foreign, carrying the acrid tang of magic rather than natural musk. Witches, she realized with growing horror. Multiple supernatural factions had converged on Silverbrook simultaneously, their coordinated assault suggesting weeks of careful planning. Elena's voice crackled through the emergency communication system. All personnel to safe rooms immediately. This is not a drill. Pete, all personnel to designated safe areas. But Sarah's safe room was across the compound, past buildings now swarming with attackers who moved with deadly purpose. Through her window, she watched Dr. Hartwell attempt to reach the main building only to be intercepted by 3 vampires whose fangs gleamed in the pre-dawn light. She was trapped, surrounded by enemies who had come specifically for her. The front door of her cabin exploded inward in a shower of splinters. A witch stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with eldritch power and her hands wreathed in flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Luna, child," the witch hissed, her voice carrying unnatural harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. "Your bloodline ends tonight." Before the witch could strike, a massive black shape hurtled through the shattered doorway. Adrian's wolf form was even more terrifying in person than in her dreams, a creature of shadow and muscle that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His jaws closed around the witch's throat with a wet crunch that ended her chanting mid-syllable. Transition from wolf to human happened so quickly Sarah almost missed it. One moment Adrian was tearing out the witch's throat, the next he stood naked and blood spattered in her doorway, golden eyes blazing with primal fury. "More are coming," he said, his voice rough with barely contained violence. "Stay behind me." They emerged into chaos. The research station had become a battleground where supernatural creatures fought with savage intensity. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as Adrian moved through the attackers like a force of nature, his bare hands tearing through enemies with efficiency that spoke of centuries of combat experience. A vampire lunged at them from the left, fangs extended and claws ready to rend flesh. Adrian caught the creature mid-leap, his fingers closing around its throat with crushing force. The vampire's neck snapped with a sound like breaking kindling, and Adrian tossed the body aside without breaking stride. 2 more vampires attacked in concert, trying to flank them from opposite sides. Adrian's response was brutally elegant. He spun between their attacks, one hand catching the first vampire's wrist and twisting until bone cracked. The creature's agonized scream was cut short when Adrian's other hand punched through its chest, emerging from the other side with the vampire's heart still beating in his grip. The second vampire hesitated, clearly reconsidering its attack strategy. Adrian's smile was all sharp teeth and predatory hunger as he crushed the stolen heart in his fist, blood running between his fingers like wine. The vampire fled. But even Adrian's supernatural prowess couldn't be everywhere at once. A group of witches had cornered Dr. Cross near the main building, their combined magic creating a barrier of crackling energy that prevented escape. Sarah watched helplessly as the women raised their hands in unison, power building between them like gathering storm clouds. "Elena," she breathed, starting forward despite the danger. Adrian's arms snaked around her waist, pulling her back against his blood-slicked chest. "Don't," he growled in her ear. She knew the risks when she chose to work for me. Casual dismissal of Elena's life sent rage blazing through Sarah's chest. "How can you say that?" "She's been protecting me, helping me understand what I am." "She's been doing her job," Adrian corrected, his grip tightening possessively. "Just as I'm doing mine now." The witch's spell reached its crescendo, power erupting in a pillar of white-hot energy that consumed everything within a 20-foot radius. When the light faded, nothing remained where Dr. Cross had been standing except scorched earth and the acrid smell of burned magic. Sarah's knees buckled, grief and horror overwhelming her senses. Elena had died protecting her, had died because Adrian's obsession with claiming a Luna mate had painted a target on everyone associated with Sarah's bloodline. The surviving attackers began to retreat, apparently deciding that Adrian's presence made their mission too costly to continue. But their withdrawal felt more like a tactical regrouping than genuine defeat. They had tested his defenses, learned his capabilities, and now they would plan accordingly for the next assault. Adrian surveyed the carnage with satisfaction, his naked form painted with the blood of their enemies. In the growing daylight, he looked less like a man and more like some ancient god of war, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It's over, he said, finally releasing his grip on Sarah's waist. For now. Over? Sarah stared at the smoking ruins of buildings she'd called home, at the bodies scattered across ground that had been peaceful just hours before. Elena is dead. Half the research staff is dead. How is any of this over? Adrian's expression softened as he cupped her face in his blood-stained hands. They came for you, he said gently. Every supernatural faction that opposes my rule sees your awakening Luna powers as either a weapon to claim or a threat to eliminate. This was inevitable the moment your heritage manifested. His thumb traced her cheekbone with surprising tenderness, leaving a smear of crimson across her pale skin. But I protected you, he continued, his voice dropping to that hypnotic rumble that made her wolf whimper with recognition. I will always protect you because you belong to me now. The possessive certainty in his words should have terrified her. Instead, Sarah found herself leaning into his touch, craving the safety his presence promised even as her rational mind recoiled from the violence she'd witnessed. This is what loving me means, Adrian said, seeming to read her thoughts. Blood and death and enemies who will never stop coming. Are you strong enough for that reality, my Luna? Looking into his golden eyes, seeing the savage protectiveness burning there alongside something that might have been genuine affection, Sarah realized she was already lost. The careful seduction, the patient manipulation, the displays of power and wealth, all of it had been leading to this moment when she would have to choose between safety and surrender. But there was no safety anymore. The supernatural world knew what she was now, knew the power she carried in her blood. Whether she accepted Adrian's claim or not, she would spend the rest of her life running from those who would use her or destroy her. At least with Adrian, she wouldn't be running alone. I'm strong enough, she whispered, the words sealing her fate as surely as any mating bond. Adrian's smile was triumphant and possessive and tinged with something that looked almost like relief. Then let me claim you properly, he said, his voice rough with desperate need. Let me make you mine before anyone else tries to take you from me. As he lowered his head toward her throat, Sarah caught a glimpse of his elongated canines and realized that her choice had been an illusion all along. Adrian had been planning this moment since the night he'd first appeared in her cabin, had orchestrated every encounter to bring them to this point of inevitable surrender. She was about to become the Alpha King's mate, whether she truly wanted it or not. Adrian's compound rose from the mountainside like a medieval fortress carved from black stone, its towers and battlements designed to withstand both natural disasters and supernatural assault. As their helicopters circled the landing pad, Sarah caught glimpses of defensive measures that spoke of centuries of paranoia, silver-inlaid walls that would repel vampires, iron gates warded against fey magic, and grounds that hummed with protective enchantments. This is your new home, Adrian said as they descended, his hand possessive on her knee. Every luxury you could desire, every protection money and power can provide. But as they landed, Sarah noticed the subtle details that revealed the compound's true nature. Guards stationed at every entrance, their eyes tracking her movements with predatory intensity. Security cameras that followed their progress from the landing pad to the main building. Electronic locks on every door that required Adrian's personal authorization to open. This wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage designed to keep something precious and dangerous from escaping. The interior was breathtaking in its opulence, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across walls hung with priceless artwork. But Sarah's wolf sensed the underlying wrongness immediately. This place reeked of fear, of women who had walked these halls before her and left behind only the echo of their terror. Adrian led her through corridors lined with portraits of beautiful women from different eras, each painted with the same expression of adoration and submission. His previous companions, Sarah realized with growing horror, preserved in oil and canvas long after their physical forms had vanished from existence. Your quarters, Adrian announced, opening a door to reveal a suite that belonged in a luxury hotel. Everything had been prepared for her arrival. Closets filled with expensive clothing in her exact size, jewelry that sparkled with supernatural enhancement, even personal items from her cabin at Silverbrook carefully arranged on the dressing table. How long have you been planning this? She asked, running her fingers over a silk dress that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Adrian's smile held dark satisfaction. Since the moment I learned of your existence. Every detail has been considered, every contingency planned for. You'll want for nothing here, my Luna. Except freedom, Sarah thought but didn't say. The unspoken truth hung between them like a blade. Over the following days, Adrian's behavior grew increasingly possessive and erratic. He insisted on escorting her everywhere, his hand never leaving some part of her body as if physical contact was necessary to maintain his claim. Meals were brought to her room rather than eaten in the communal dining areas, isolating her from the few other residents of the compound. When she asked to explore the grounds alone, Adrian's golden eyes flashed with something dangerous. Not safe, he said, his voice carrying absolute finality. There are too many who would hurt you to get to me. But Sarah suspected the real danger came from within. She'd caught glimpses of Adrian's true nature during their helicopter conversations, moments when his civilized mask slipped to reveal something ancient and predatory underneath. He spoke of her wolf directly now, using his alpha authority to compel her submission in ways that left her feeling violated and helpless. The claiming was scheduled for the full moon, a traditional werewolf mating ritual that would bind them together permanently. Adrian explained the ceremony with clinical detachment, describing how his bite would mark her as his mate while awakening the full extent of her Luna powers. You'll feel some discomfort during the transformation, he said as servants prepared the ritual chamber. But once your heritage fully manifests, you'll understand why this was necessary. The ritual chamber was carved from natural stone, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The center lay an altar draped in white silk, surrounded by artifacts that hummed with dark magic. Sarah recognized some of them from her research, objects of power that had been used in Luna ceremonies for centuries. As the full moon reached its peak, Adrian led her into the chamber wearing nothing but a thin ceremonial gown that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. His own clothing had been replaced by ritual garb that emphasized his role as Alpha King, all black leather and silver chains that caught the moonlight streaming through an opening in the chamber's roof. "Are you ready, my Luna?" he asked, his voice rough with barely contained need. Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to run, wanted to fight against the destiny that had been chosen for her without her consent. But surrounded by dark magic and faced with Adrian's overwhelming presence, she found herself nodding in mute surrender. Adrian's kiss was possessive and hungry, his hands roaming her body with the confidence of ownership. When he lowered her to the altar, the silk beneath her back felt like a burial shroud, soft and final. His bite, when it came, was nothing like the gentle claiming she'd imagined from romantic stories. Adrian's fangs sank deep into her throat with savage intensity, drawing blood that tasted of copper and power. Pain exploded through her nervous system, followed immediately by a rush of supernatural energy that made her vision blur white. But instead of the simple mate bond Adrian expected, something else awakened in Sarah's blood. The Luna heritage he'd been so eager to claim responded to his bite with volcanic force, power that had been dormant for generations suddenly erupting into consciousness. Silver light poured from her skin, so bright it banished the chamber's shadows and made Adrian stumble backward with a startled cry. Sarah felt her body changing, not into wolf form but into something else entirely. Something that matched Adrian's darkness with equal and opposite force. When the transformation stabilized, Sarah looked down at herself in wonder. Her skin glowed with inner light, her hair had turned silver white, and her eyes burned with power that made Adrian's golden gaze seem dim by comparison. She was still recognizably herself, but elevated to something that transcended ordinary supernatural categories. Adrian stared at her with a mixture of awe and hunger that made her newly awakened instincts recoil. "Magnificent," he breathed, reaching toward her with trembling fingers. But when his hand touched her glowing skin, both of them cried out in shock. Contact created a feedback loop of power that sent them both to their knees, connected but not bonded, transformed but not claimed. Sarah could feel Adrian's emotions through their incomplete link, could sense his desperate need for her that bordered on madness. But she could also feel her own power, vast and terrible and completely beyond his control. The Luna Queen had awakened, and she was far stronger than either of them had anticipated. Changes began at dawn. Sarah woke from her first night as a partially claimed Luna to find her enhanced senses overwhelmed by a cacophony of supernatural presences stretching far beyond the compound walls. She could feel every werewolf pack within a 100-mile radius, their emotions and locations as clear as if they were standing in her room. Vampire covens pulsed like cold stars in her awareness, while witch circles hummed with magical energy that made her skin tingle. But it was her influence over these creatures that truly terrified her. When the compound's guards arrived for their morning patrol, their wolves immediately submitted to her presence without conscious thought. She watched through her window as grown men fell to their knees in the courtyard, their heads bowed in instinctive reverence to a Luna Queen whose power dwarfed their understanding. Adrian found her there, still dressed in the torn ceremonial gown from the claiming ritual, her silver hair catching morning light like spun moonbeams. His golden eyes held a mixture of awe and barely contained possessiveness that made her newly awakened instincts recoil. "How do you feel?" he asked, approaching with the careful movements of someone testing a dangerous animal's mood. "Like I'm drowning in everyone else's emotions," Sarah replied honestly. "I can sense every supernatural being for miles. Their fears, their hungers, their territorial disputes. It's overwhelming." Adrian's smile held dark satisfaction. "That's the Luna Network awakening. Your bloodline's ability to connect with multiple supernatural communities simultaneously. With practice, you'll learn to control the flow of information to influence rather than simply observe." But Sarah was already beginning to understand the true scope of her awakened abilities. When she focused on a particular werewolf pack she could sense in the distance, she felt their alpha's decision-making process shift subtly in response to her attention. When her awareness touched a vampire coven, their feeding patterns altered to avoid areas where her influence felt strongest. She wasn't just sensing these creatures. She was unconsciously commanding them. The implications sent ice through her veins. If she could influence supernatural beings without conscious effort, what would happen when she learned to use her powers deliberately? What kind of control could she exert over creatures who had never bowed to anyone's authority? Adrian seemed to read her thoughts. "Imagine it," he said, his voice dropping to that hypnotic rumble that had once made her wolf whimper with submission. "Every werewolf pack in North America responding to our combined authority. Vampire covens serving our interests. Witch circles providing magical support for our reign. We could unite the supernatural world under a single banner for the first time in history." But as he spoke, Sarah noticed something that chilled her more than his grandiose plans. Adrian's own wolf was responding to her Luna influence, his alpha authority subtly bending to accommodate her presence. The man who had orchestrated her entire life to reach this moment was discovering that he might not be able to control what he had created. The first delegation arrived before noon, 3 black SUVs carrying representatives from the eastern wolf packs. Sarah watched from her window as stern-faced alphas emerged from the vehicles, their body language broadcasting urgent concern. These weren't social visits. These were emergency consultations. Adrian met with them in his formal receiving room, but Sarah could hear every word through her enhanced senses. The conversation was exactly what she'd feared. "The Luna's awakening has destabilized pack hierarchies across the region," reported Alpha Catherine Blackthorne, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Lesser wolves are abandoning their birth packs to seek her out. Our territorial boundaries mean nothing when faced with Luna influence. My pack lost 6 members overnight," added Alpha Marcus Sterling. "They simply walked away, claiming they had to answer her call. We've never seen anything like this before." Similar reports came from delegations throughout the day. Vampire covens were experiencing unprecedented unity as ancient rivalries dissolved under Luna influence. Witch circles found their magical workings enhanced beyond normal capabilities when performed within Sarah's sphere of awareness. Even Fae courts, traditionally isolated from werewolf politics, were sending emissaries to investigate the power disturbance. By evening, Adrian's compound resembled a supernatural United Nations, with representatives from every major supernatural faction gathered to address what they saw as an existential threat to established order. Sarah listened to their discussions through walls and floors, her Luna abilities making privacy impossible for anyone within her range. Conversations were uniformly terrifying. The Luna Queen cannot be allowed to reach full power, argued a vampire elder whose age made him nearly as old as Adrian. Her influence grows stronger by the hour. Soon she'll be able to command our entire species with a thought. We must consider elimination while she's still partially bonded, suggested a witch whose magical signature felt ancient and dangerous. Better to lose one potentially useful ally than face complete subjugation. But it was the werewolf alphas who provided the most chilling assessment. She's not just awakening Luna powers, Alpha Blackthorn reported. She's evolving them. Traditional Luna abilities were limited to werewolf packs. This one influences all supernatural creatures. We're facing something unprecedented. The Emergency Supernatural Council convened that very night, a gathering of the most powerful supernatural beings in North America. Sarah felt their combined presence like a weight pressing against her consciousness. Ancient powers that had shaped the world for millennia now focused entirely on her. Through their incomplete bond, she felt Adrian's emotions shift from triumph to concern to something approaching fear. He had wanted a powerful mate who could enhance his authority. Instead, he had awakened something that threatened to eclipse his own power entirely. Council's decision reached her through whispered conversations and leaked magical communications. They would give her a choice, an ultimatum designed to contain the threat she represented while preserving what they could of the existing order. Accept complete bonding with Adrian and become Luna Queen under his guidance, submitting her powers to his control in exchange for recognition and protection. Or face immediate elimination as a rogue Luna whose awakening threatened the stability of the entire supernatural world. But as Sarah lay in her gilded cage, feeling the pulse of supernatural life stretching across the continent, she realized there might be a third option. One that neither Adrian nor the Council had considered. She could claim her birthright independently, becoming a ruler in her own right rather than anyone's subordinate. The risk would be enormous, the challenges potentially fatal. But for the first time since her rejection at the Moonrise Festival, Sarah felt the stirring of genuine hope. She was no longer the broken girl who had fled into the forest in shame. She was a Luna Queen with power beyond imagination, and perhaps it was time to stop letting others decide her fate. Question was whether she had the courage to seize control of her own destiny, knowing that the choice might destroy everything and everyone she had ever cared about. The Supernatural Council assembled in Adrian's great hall at midnight, their combined presence turning the opulent space into something that felt more like a tribunal than a negotiation. Sarah descended the marble staircase in a gown of midnight blue that Adrian had chosen for her, its fabric shimmering with threads of silver that caught the chandelier light like captured stars. Ancient vampires stood beside werewolf alphas whose bloodlines stretched back centuries. Witch matriarchs whose power made the air itself hum with electricity shared space with fey nobles whose beauty was so otherworldly it hurt to look at them directly. The center of it all sat Adrian on a throne carved from black obsidian, his golden eyes tracking Sarah's every movement with possessive intensity. But it was the figure who stepped forward as she reached the bottom of the stairs that truly commanded attention. Elder Morvain of the High Council was older than recorded history, her ageless face bearing the weight of millennia spent governing supernatural affairs. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had shaped the world before humans learned to write. "Sarah Blackwood," she intoned, her words seeming to resonate in the very stones of the hall. "You stand before this council as a Luna Queen whose awakening threatens the balance we have maintained for thousands of years." Sarah lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the overwhelming power focused on her. "I didn't ask for this awakening. I didn't choose to become what you fear." Morvain's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the flicker of something that might have been respect in her ancient eyes. Choice is a luxury rarely afforded to those born to power. Nevertheless, circumstances require that we offer you 3 paths forward. The first option was exactly what Sarah had expected. Complete bonding with Adrian Nightfall, accepting his claim and submitting her Luna powers to his guidance as Alpha King. In exchange, she would be recognized as Luna Queen with all the protections and privileges that title provided, but always under Adrian's ultimate authority. Your combined power would be channeled through established hierarchies, Morvain explained. The supernatural world would have time to adapt to your influence gradually, preventing the chaos that complete Luna independence might bring. The second option was elimination. Swift, painless, but permanent. Council would end her life before her powers could destabilize supernatural society beyond repair. Adrian's snarl of rage at this suggestion made several council members step back, but Morvain continued without flinching. We do not offer this choice lightly, but precedent exists. Previous Luna Queens who refused bonding have brought nothing but war and destruction to our kind. But it was the third option that surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. You may claim your Luna birthright independently, Morvain said, her voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like challenge. Reject Adrian's claim, refuse our authority, and rule as your ancestors did in the ancient days. But understand that such a choice would make you enemy to every established power structure in the supernatural world. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs and angry protests. Several alphas demanded to know why such an option was even being presented, while vampire elders hissed about the dangerous precedent it would set. Adrian rose from his throne, power radiating from him in waves that made the chandeliers tremble. You cannot seriously be considering this, he said, his voice deadly quiet. An independent Luna Queen would shatter everything we've built. Perhaps, Morvain replied calmly. Or perhaps it would restore what was lost when the Luna bloodlines first went into hiding. The choice is hers to make. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the pressure of expectations and fears and desperate hopes all focused on her decision. Through her incomplete bond with Adrian, she could feel his emotions churning like a storm, terror and fury, and something that might have been heartbreak warring for dominance. Before she could respond, Adrian moved to her side, his presence both protective and possessive. May I speak with her privately before she decides? He asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a request. Morvain nodded once. You have 1 hour. Choose wisely, both of you. Adrian led Sarah to his private study, a room lined with books and artifacts from across the centuries. Here, away from the council's scrutiny, his composed mask finally cracked to reveal the desperation underneath. Sarah, he said, his voice breaking on her name. Please don't choose independence. Don't throw away everything we could build together. She studied his face, seeing past the supernatural beauty to the ancient loneliness that drove his every action. For the first time since meeting him, Adrian looked vulnerable, almost fragile in his need for her acceptance. Tell me why, she said quietly. Not what the council wants to hear, not what serves your political ambitions. Tell me why you really want this bond. Adrian was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of centuries. I've been alone for over 100 years, he admitted. Ruling, conquering, accumulating power, but always alone. Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by people who fear you too much to truly love you? To have everything except the one thing that makes existence bearable? His hands found hers, golden eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. I've searched for a Luna mate for decades because I believed such a bond could change me, could make me worthy of genuine affection instead of terrified submission. The honesty in his voice made her chest ache. But your previous companions, she pressed. What happened to them? They weren't you, Adrian said simply. They were beautiful, intelligent, fascinating in their own ways. But they weren't Luna Queens. The bond one formed with them was artificial, forced, ultimately unsustainable. When they realized they could never truly love someone they feared, when the pretense became too much to bear, I let them go. Let them go where? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. To whatever afterlife awaits our kind, Adrian replied, his voice heavy with old guilt. I couldn't bear to watch them suffer in a relationship that brought them nothing but fear, and I couldn't risk them revealing supernatural secrets to human authorities. It was mercy of a sort. The admission hung between them like a blade. Adrian had killed his previous companions out of what he convinced himself was kindness, unable to face the reality that love built on fear and power imbalances could never be real. But you're different, he continued urgently. You have Luna powers that match my alpha authority. Our bond would be between equals, based on mutual strength rather than dominance and submission. We could revolutionize supernatural society, create a world where power serves love instead of the other way around. Sarah felt the truth in his words, the genuine belief that their combined abilities could reshape the supernatural world for the better. But she also felt the subtle pressure of his influence, the way his alpha authority still tried to sway her decision even in this moment of supposed honesty. You still want to control me, she said softly. Even now, you're using your power to influence my choice. Adrian's face crumpled as he realized what he was doing. His supernatural influence withdrew immediately, leaving Sarah feeling oddly bereft without its warm pressure. I'm sorry, he whispered. It's instinct, the need to ensure my mate's safety and compliance. But you're right. Even my attempts at honesty are tainted by the desire to possess you. The hour was almost up when Sarah finally spoke. I need to know something, she said. If I choose independence, if I reject your claim and face the council's hostility alone, would you stand with me or against me? Adrian's silence was answer enough. His loyalty was to the supernatural order he had spent a century building, not to a mate who threatened to tear it all down. I understand, Sarah said, though her heart broke a little at his inability to choose her over his crown. As they returned to the great hall, Sarah's decision crystallized with perfect clarity. She had been shaped by rejection and manipulation for too long, had spent too many years letting others determine her worth and her future. It was time to claim her own destiny, regardless of the cost. Council waited in tense silence as she took her place before them, her silver hair catching the light like a crown of stars. Elder Morvain stepped forward, ancient eyes holding something that looked almost like approval. Have you decided? She asked. Sarah lifted her chin, feeling her Luna power rise in response to her determination. I have, she said, her voice carrying across the hall with supernatural resonance. And my choice will surprise you all. I choose a fourth option, Sarah announced, her voice ringing with newfound authority. I will bond with Adrian, but not as his subordinate. We will be equals in power, partners in rule, bound by love rather than dominance. The great hall erupted in shocked protests and angry objections, but Sarah's Luna power rose around her like silver fire, compelling silence from every supernatural being present. Even Elder Morvain stepped back as ancient magic responded to Sarah's will with volcanic force. This is impossible, Adrian breathed, though his golden eyes blazed with desperate hope. The mate bond has never worked that way. Alpha authority cannot be shared. Then we'll create something new, Sarah replied, reaching for his hands with steady determination. I won't be your possession, Adrian, but I won't abandon what we could build together either. Help me reshape the bond itself. The ritual that followed nearly destroyed them both. Using her awakened Luna powers, Sarah began to dismantle the traditional mating bond structure that had governed supernatural relationships for millennia. Instead of the hierarchical connection that made her subordinate to Adrian's alpha authority, she wove something entirely different. Pain beyond description tore through both their souls as ancient magic fought against this unprecedented restructuring. Blood ran from their eyes and mouths as their very essence was rewritten on a fundamental level. Several times, the agony became so intense that Sarah nearly abandoned the attempt, but Adrian's grip on her hands kept her anchored. Through their transforming bond, she felt his terror and wonder in equal measure. He was losing the absolute control that had defined his existence for over a century, but gaining something far more precious in return. a true partner who could match his strength without fearing his power. When the reshaping finally completed, they collapsed together on the marble floor, gasping for breath that felt foreign in their changed bodies. The bond between them hummed with balanced energy, alpha and Luna powers intertwined but equal, each enhancing the other without dominance or submission. The supernatural council stared in stunned silence as Adrian and Sarah rose together, their combined authority filling the hall with pressure that made ancient beings kneel involuntarily. They were no longer king and consort but something unprecedented in supernatural history. True partners. Equal rulers. A mated pair whose love had literally rewritten the laws of nature. The impact on supernatural society was immediate and revolutionary. Wolf packs across North America found their rigid hierarchies softening as female wolves gained unprecedented influence in pack decisions. The traditional system where alphas ruled through fear and dominance gave way to partnerships based on mutual respect and shared strength. Other supernatural communities watched these changes with mixture of fascination and concern, but none could deny the stability that Adrian and Sarah's new model brought to werewolf society. Conflicts that had raged for generations found peaceful resolution as their combined authority mediated disputes with unprecedented fairness. Elder Morvain approached them as the other council members gradually accepted this new reality. "What you have accomplished tonight will echo through supernatural history for millennia to come," she said, her ancient voice carrying grudging respect. "The High Council recognizes your joint sovereignty, though we reserve the right to intervene if your experiment threatens the greater supernatural balance." Adrian and Sarah exchanged glances, their bond allowing perfect communication without words. They had won more than recognition. They had proven that love could triumph over tradition, that equality could coexist with power, that the mate bond could be partnership rather than possession. As the council dispersed and dawn approached, Adrian turned to Sarah with wonder still shining in his golden eyes. "You saved us both tonight," he said softly. "Not just from the council's ultimatum, but from the poisonous relationship we would have built on dominance and fear." Sarah smiled, feeling complete for the first time since her rejection at the Moonrise Festival. "We saved each other," she corrected. "And maybe in doing so we saved the entire supernatural world from repeating the same destructive patterns forever." Their kiss tasted of blood and magic and the promise of a future where love truly conquered all. 2 years later, Sarah stood before a gathering of young wolves at the Luna Academy, the educational institution she had founded to teach supernatural children about consent and choice in mating bonds. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light as she addressed students whose eyes held hope instead of fear for their romantic futures. "Remember," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reshaped the supernatural world through sheer determination, "you are never obligated to accept a bond that diminishes your worth. True mates enhance each other's strength, they don't demand submission to prove love." From the doorway, Adrian watched with pride and wonder that had only grown stronger over their years together. Their daughter slept peacefully in his arms, a perfect blend of their combined bloodlines whose silver eyes promised powers that would surpass even her parents' extraordinary abilities. The supernatural world had indeed entered a new era, one where strength served love instead of demanding its sacrifice. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had transformed rejection into revolution, proving that sometimes the greatest power came not from claiming what you wanted, but from refusing to accept anything less than what you deserved. Their love story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become hope for every supernatural being who had ever dreamed of finding their equal rather than their master. In reshaping their own bond, Adrian and Sarah had given their entire world permission to choose love over tradition, partnership over possession, and equality over submission. The Luna Queen had risen not to rule through fear, but to reign through the revolutionary power of genuine love.